Should I call you Lindsay Dann or Mr. Dan?
I think Lindsay Dann would be better, Harley. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me on GV Talks, Lindsay.
Not a problem.
I've stolen you away from your friends today you just mentioned.
Oh, yeah, I've just had coffee with my boyfriends. We have a regular Thursday coffee date, a couple of ex-teachers.
Yeah.
And then I've just had a quick bite to eat with my wife and one of our sons.
When did that tradition start?
Basically, after we all finished teaching, we taught together at Shepparton High School for 20 years, and then I left at the end of year 2007.
Yeah.
And one of my mates finished just before me, and the other one continued teaching to just a few years ago. But yeah, there were four of us, one no longer with us, and we've had a Wednesday, Thursday coffee date for, I don't know, probably 13 years or more.
Yeah. So teaching is what brought you all together.
Yes, certainly was, yeah.
What does the conversation revolve around these days?
Well, we don't talk about teaching. It's just talk about everyday life, our families. The other two are into a bit of yabbing and so on, so we talk a bit about what's happening in the rivers.
Yeah.
And we talk about a fair bit of other stuff.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Before we get too deep into it, do you want to let the Shepparton people know who they're listening to?
I'm Lindsay Dann, 30 years in education, 20 years teaching at Shepparton High School. My passion there was for history, but in the last 2 or 3 years, I actually taught a bit of cooking at the Year 8 level, which I really enjoyed.
Yeah, wow. Do you make special meals for your daughter Claire?
I've been known to do the odd meal for the family, and particularly Claire, but she's a bit of a hard case now with her gluten and dairy free stuff, and yeah, I really have to try hard for her.
Yeah. You brought it up off air, but do you want to tell people how you got into history? Oh,
I was in Year 9, and it was actually the Rotary Club ran a train of knowledge. So that was rural students were given a free trip to Melbourne, a day trip on the train, and we got to visit different workplaces. And I actually went out to Coburg Teachers College, and it's a real classic because David Parkin, the famous Carlton Hawthorn footballer and coach, he was a secondary teacher, but he was teaching at Coburg Teachers College. And I saw him and I thought, well, that's an everyday person. Yeah, and that inspired me to become a teacher, and my favourite subject was history. So I just led on to there and finished Year 12 and got into the La Trobe Uni in Melbourne and did a history and politics degree. The La Trobe Uni then had the best known history faculty in Australia, and that was a pretty exciting time.
Is that what you aimed for?
Oh, no way. Funnily enough, during Year 11, I sat the Victorian Public Service exam. My parents took me down to Bendigo, and I did that. And I found out a week or so later that I'd been accepted into the public service. And I thought, that'll be all right, there's a good career. And then my mum and dad said, do you really want that, or do you want to go back to high school? Well, I said, I want to go back to high school because I just love school. So back I went and had a very successful Year 12, and it wasn't just academically, it was socially and sport, because I'm right into sport. I've had a lot to do with that as a student, and then certainly as a teacher and coach for many years in secondary school sports and administration.
Yeah, it's great that your parents didn't push you to take the route of public service.
Well, certainly not, but our parents were just fantastic about, they gave us opportunities. And they said, you go with what you want. And for me, I'm so thankful because I became a teacher, my younger brother became a teacher, and our eldest sister was a teacher. And there was no push at all from my dad, who was, well, he had no formal skills. He finished Year 8, what they called it, Grade 8 at the time, at a little primary secondary school in Barron. And he went off and worked as a box boy in the local supermarket, then off to World War II, where he served in the Middle East and New Guinea, and after the war he got into Stockton Station Agency worked for people, and then he started his own business, which he did until he retired in 1983. And our mum trained as a nurse, and did a little bit of nursing, but then started the family, and that was it. She just helped Dad out every now and again in the office at the shop in Barron.
Wow. Did you want to emulate anyone in your life as you were growing up? Like, did you see a teacher and think...
Well, not just one, but I saw teachers as being inspirational people, and it just came, and maybe the teacher I had in year 12, who was only new to the school, and he hadn't lived in the rural area, he came along and he was just full of so much energy. I think that probably made me want to be a teacher even more. I was very lucky growing up in a small community and having very caring people who taught us.
What characteristics do you think make a good teacher?
Well, certainly empathy, knowledge. You need to have a really good understanding of, for example, your subject area, but also understand how people work, because you're working with all sorts of people from, in a secondary school, maybe an 11-year-old up to an 18, 19-year-old, and then you've got the plethora of teachers who might be, say, 21 and up to, who knows, 65 or more. So you do have contact with lots of different people.
Do you think kids these days understand why school's so important?
Probably not in general. A lot of people just see it as a means to an end, particularly in getting a job, and the pressure that's been put on, particularly at VCE level, does change things. But certainly, if you look around Shepparton, the success rate of heading off to university and coming back is there, but not at a great deal. And I look around at the number of people who grew up in this town and basically never left, who run magnificent businesses and employ lots of people. And that's something that you really need to be proud of.
Yeah, definitely. People see school as a means to an end. What skills do you think somebody learns at school? Because in my experience, like I went to school to get a job. That was how I looked at it. But in hindsight, like I think what I was there to actually do was learn how to communicate, learn how to negotiate, learn how to structure conversations, be surrounded by great books, all these other like things that weren't so obvious. But I don't feel like any teacher told me that while I was there.
And I don't think it's really a formal thing there, Harley. It's like osmosis. You just work away, because in a classroom, say you've got 25 kids, in this town there are incredible variety and differences in their skill set. So for me as a history teacher, which I see as being extremely important, because it's not just history in general, it can be an individual's experience, it can be the family, the group and the whole town. And in a place like Shepparton, with our multicultural community, we've got incredible experiences in this town that we can all learn from. And in the study of history, which is, I think, an essential subject, not because of when something happened, but you learn and study how and why it happened. And in your research skills, particularly the investigation, and then having to build an argument in the study of history, you then have to think about why something happened, how it happened, and then be able to argue to an end. And I think, even though it's not explicit in terms of here it is in a list of things that you will learn, that's just the way that we work in that thing. And I look at all the other subjects and see, as an historian, mathematics, geography, science, they're all just part of that experience, depending on what line you're looking at.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Obviously, you build all those skills that you just mentioned, which I agree are very important. What job leads from studying history? Well,
it's not heading you straight into a job, Harley. It's more about the skills that you will improve on, learn and improve on, will help you get a job. In your thinking skills, your writing skills, your ability to look at a situation, form an opinion and have an argument to back it up, which is then evidence, will I believe, help you get a job.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. Do you think it's a popular subject?
Once upon a time, it was a very popular subject. And I look back at, say, 15 to 20 years ago, at Shepparton High School, we had 2 Year 12 history groups, which is pretty incredible. And we were teaching Australian history. And then, depending on the dynamics, I said it changed. And unfortunately, where there would have been senior history classes at all the 4 campuses that we had, now I think you'd struggle to find them at 1 or 2 campuses. It's just been a subject that, in a sense, has died off at the senior level, I believe, which is very disappointing to me.
Can you elaborate on why you think it's disappointing?
Well, it's such an important subject in my mind about knowing where you came from, but being able to explain why you're here, not just as the individual, but we can look closely at, as I said, our multicultural society. We think right back for thousands of years when it was just the indigenous people who lived on this land, and then as the Europeans became braver, and I look at those sailors in particular who travelled the world on tiny ships that we wouldn't be seen out on probably Victoria Lake, and they travelled the world in those small ships, and rightly or wrongly they had their contact with different cultures, and essentially I guess the Europeans were stronger and took over many lands, and that's greatly changed the landscape everywhere.
Why do you think people used to be so brave? Because I would look at a situation like that and I watch these battles and all this sort of stuff. I wouldn't stand in the front lines.
Well, I can't explain it because I guess our time has been relatively safe.
Yes.
I think back to my father's generation, where some of the men there fought in 2 wars, and my dad fought in 1. And I haven't had to be involved in a conflict. In one sense, I was born just too late to be involved in the Vietnam War, thankfully. What a horrific experience that must have been. I've met people who did go to Vietnam, and their psychological problems that they've had are just horrific, and I know that must be the case for many, and that's just in the conflict situation.
Yeah. Do you have like a special appreciation or anything for World War II that your father was involved in?
Well, it's really funny in that I was really close to my dad and spent a lot of time with him, and I can only remember him talking twice about his experience in the war, and they were basically insignificant. He wasn't talking about the battles or whatever, but just the experience. For example, when they were in the Middle East and Prime Minister Curtin said to the British, we're bringing our soldiers home from Israel or Jerusalem, the decision was made, put all the Australian soldiers on ships and sail from the Red Sea to Perth in a straight line. Now, we all know that when those ships are travelling, they zigzag so that they can't be attacked, particularly by submarines.
Yeah.
And my dad told me the story of one night they were steaming along and they did a head count and someone was missing. And they all said, oh, that's funny. So the soldiers had been told that if someone fell overboard, for example, we wouldn't be stopping. They did the head count, they worked out that one of the soldiers was missing, and when it was reported to the ship's captain, he said, all right, they turned the ship around, put the floodlights on, and it takes kilometres to slow down a ship and turn it, and they didn't know where this bloke could be, and they sailed back with the floodlights on, and they found the bloke. Now, out in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Incredible experience. Now, talk about how would you feel when you fell over? You knew you'd be dead.
Yeah.
Yeah, that ship won't be coming back for me. So that was just one story that Dad told me, but like many of that generation and their experiences, they didn't talk about what they saw and did.
In history, when there's been an epidemic, have people traditionally banded together or kind of gone to arms towards each other?
Well, I don't think what we've seen in 2020 has happened in a sense before. I understand there's been the Black Death, the bubonic plague, and then there was the Spanish influenza in 1919 in Australia that killed 20,000 people or so, and that was pretty horrific. But with the medicine and technology that we have today, with science, we've got people who are working on saving us. But certainly, when you look at what's happened in Europe, say Italy, England, and over there in the United States, the number of people who've been infected and have died, and then you look at what's happened in our country, we are very, very lucky living here.
Yeah. Do you know how people are acting towards each other in those countries, where it's a little bit more intense?
Well, we can see a fair bit about what's happening in the United States because that's been highlighted so much recently. I do have close friends who from Shep who have family in Italy, and we're in contact with them, and they're still in lockdown. Luckily, they haven't been affected with any deaths in their family, but still here we are, February, March, and it's January the next year, and they're still locked down right across Italy.
So, what do you think Australia did well?
Well,
it would obviously, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it would be beneficial being so far away from everywhere else.
Well, that's the beautiful thing about the isolation of Australia and being able to shut our doors from people from overseas, because it's very difficult to get here. And I think we have managed the situation pretty well. A little bit horrific in effect in Victoria there for a while when you look at the other states, but we're well over that now.
Yeah.
And our isolation is a real thing about our safety.
What did Australia do when the swine flu was here?
Well, I don't think I've really read much about that or followed it, but obviously not the problems that they had in other places in the world.
Yeah. What are some of your favourite moments in history?
Oh, now that's a really tough one, Harley, because there's just so much. So I enjoy the story of Australia and what Australians have done for such a small, populated country. We've had incredible successes, whether it be literature, science, mathematics. It just goes on and on. And I think Australians, in a sense, are often inspirational in that what we do from a very small populated place to where we've ended up in the world, and how our government can sit at the world stage and be listened to.
Yeah. Can you summarise the history of Australia for the listeners?
Well, we had a very, very long time where the Indigenous people had no trouble from us Europeans. So they had thousands of years where they just wandered the land as a nomadic people in their own areas until the coming of the Europeans, particularly the British, in the late 1700s, and that's after the arrival of the First Fleet in 1788. Things obviously changed, and apart from the fact that it was foreign people coming and taking land, it was, for example, the simple illnesses that they brought with them. A simple cold to a European, you get a runny nose, but to the Aboriginal people who had never come across these germs, it must have been life-threatening.
Yeah.
And we can read about some of the experiences there.
Have you read a book called Sapiens?
No.
A Brief History on the World. It dwells into what you just mentioned there and all the species and people that we've lost by the Europeans coming to Australia. Do you think what moments in history do you reckon have shaped our civilization the most?
Well, certainly for Australians, we'd have the coming of the First Fleet in 1788, bringing the British here. 1901, with the Federation of the Australian States, and finally a federal government. Involvement in the Great War, that is the First World War, was a very important moment because a lot of people think that was when Australia came of age.
Yeah.
The Australian soldiers and our government standing up beside the British, not just following the British line. And then again, World War II, very important moments in our history. But there are just so many more, and it could be a simple thing about the success of our sporting people. And if you remember Kathy Freeman at the Olympics, what an amazing time that was. And when Australians are just so proud of who we were, to see that lady become a world champion.
Yeah, definitely. In some of the sports that I follow, Australia gets described as young, and that's why we're not performing as well.
Young. Our people, like, as a country, if you want to put an age to it, if you're talking young, then you're referring to, say, the beginning of the Commonwealth in 1901.
Yeah.
But you look at our people, so those of us with the European background, we go back thousands of years with our families.
Yeah.
It's not just the fact that my great-grandparents moved to Australia in the mid-1800s. We have a lineage for many years in England.
Yeah.
And that lineage would go right back, for example, to the Battle of Hastings in 1066. So it's not just the fact that we are young, we all have a long history somewhere.
Yeah. When the British arrived in Australia, they were dropping off convicts?
Well, they were starting a new colony, and it was manned by convicts, yes. There were administrators, there were the Marines or sailor soldiers who were there to protect or to act as prison guards.
Yeah.
And then there were the hundreds of prisoners on the 11 ships. And then the second fleet came, and then bit by bit it was opened up to free immigration.
It would have been a pretty rough place at the start. Do you think the British people would have been better off sending a different demographic of people over here?
Oh, I'm probably thinking you wouldn't have got volunteers to do what those people did.
Yeah.
And our understanding is that there was no selection of skilled people out of the prisons in England. It was, let's just get this mob out. So the skill set wasn't even looked at. And it wasn't even the fact that it was looked at in terms of demographics, male to female ratios. They were just people chosen, slapped on ships and sent out. So it would have been horrific to come out here and there's not a building to be seen. And then if you've ever visited Tasmania and had a look at Port Arthur, the conditions in which those who committed crimes in the colony in the early days were sent to, that's quite horrific.
So would you say us arriving here was a tragic event?
Certainly for the Aboriginal people of that time, but in terms of opening this part of the world up to, which has happened everywhere else.
Yeah.
It's not like Australia was the only place to be invaded by the Europeans, because they controlled South America, North America, Africa, you name it. The Europeans have invaded in one form or another over hundreds and hundreds of years. So I see it today as having been a social experiment that effectively has been successful when you look at 24 million or so Australians, and the vast majority of us have a good life and a safe and secure life.
Do you think overpopulation is going to be a problem in the future?
It's a very big country.
Yeah.
What are we? The sixth largest country by area in the world?
Yeah.
And 24 million people or so isn't that many when you look at what maybe the largest city in the world is in China with 30 million in one city. So I see that we've got plenty of land, but it's how we treat that land that's important to feeding us all. And at the moment, we can feed us and a fair bit of the world too. So as long as we respect what we've got, things should be pretty successful.
Yeah. There's never been a problem with overpopulation in the past?
Well, I don't think so. If you look at maybe the spread of Melbourne, with the population they have there of 5 odd million, the area that they've taken up now that people expect to have their own block of land. That's encroaching further and further. And you look at the drive to Melbourne now. Well, Melbourne starts virtually at Calcallo.
Yeah.
When once upon a time Calcallo was, that was way out of Melbourne.
Yeah.
And then out Mernda and through that way, nearly to Whittlesea for our northern end. So Melbourne is still continuing to grow quite rapidly, and that's impinging on the fringe areas. And then I note that during this COVID stuff, people are selling up in Melbourne, heading to rural and regional areas, and I think we're finding the benefit of that a little bit.
Do you think your study of history has helped you financially?
Well,
in terms of like you would see things repeat themselves, like the share market go down and...
Yes, all that. Yeah, you've got all those sorts of things. And once again, in the study of history, if you follow something, you're encouraged to learn it in depth, make a decision about what you're going to do, and that should be based on evidence. And that's a very important thing. Analyse something, look at why and how things have happened, and form an opinion and have evidence to back up your viewpoint. So you could look at the stock exchange. But in terms of me, I think because I did well at history in year 12, that helped me get into university, the first one in my family to do so.
Yeah.
And it got me a studentship where the state government paid me to go to university, a princely sum of $17.85 a week in 1972. But that got me going on the path to becoming a teacher. And then in the 1970s, we had basically a booming population, so more teachers were needed. And yeah, I was very lucky I got a job. And for me, I started in 1977 at Cobram High School. I had a great 5 years there, a wonderful community. And then 4 years over at Kerrang High School, where I'd been a student. It was my high school. And then about 20 years at Shepparton High School. And those experiences have just been incredible.
Yeah. How did the students change over those 20 years?
Oh, I think probably my description today is that we're seeing the McDonald's generation of students. They want instant gratification. You go in the line, you get to the front of the queue, and a minute later, you've got your feed in hand and you can walk out. Well, life isn't like that. You know, and I'm finding that the younger generation are expecting things to be given to them in general rather than earned. I hear so much about I've got rights, but we rarely hear I've also got responsibilities. So there's that expectation, and maybe it could be at school where the teachers have to help me get my VCE if that's as far as you want to go.
Yeah.
But in getting the help, you've got responsibilities about doing your own study, because you, in the end, have to complete the exam or write the paper, etc.
How do you think it's going to develop moving forward? Do you reckon it'll get worse, or do you think people come... Because I haven't been to school, but that would be my analysis of it from the outside. Like, it's a lot different to when I was there. So I just wonder if what will happen moving forward if that continues.
Well, schools, teaching and learning is always in a state of flux, and that there's always something new, in a sense, happening about what's expected. Now, we've got big changes happening in our school communities in Shepparton and Mooroopna. It's going to be interesting to see what happens there and where our students end up. But in the end, the demographics coming out of schools would show us that something like 60% of the students will stay and work in this town.
Yeah.
And a smaller proportion, and I don't know what it would be out of that other 40%, would end up at university or the colleges. So really, the vast majority of our work is making sure that the businesses in Shepparton will be able to improve and employ our young people. There'll always be those who head off to study, and the next thing will be our own university the Latrobe campus, how big that could get. And then we've got GoTAFE. And I think in lots of ways we're missing the old tech schools, of which Shepparton had 2 up until the 1990s. And now we're down to none. And so many of our successful people went through those tech schools, and they've got big businesses who are important players in the jobs in our town.
Yeah. Why did the tech school shut down?
That was a state government decision in the mid-1990s. And the government at the time decided that every school should be essentially equal.
Yeah.
We lost the old North Tech. It was shut down. It maybe had about 200 students when it was finished, but there have been many people who went through that school and did well, and those students and staff were absorbed amongst the other schools in the town. And at Shep High we ended up with basically a woodwork and a metalwork classroom over on Ford Reserve, which is across from the old building there. All the locals know about Ford Reserve. Those old tech schools just disappeared. And South Tech, Maguire, still there in a sense, but that skill set of people who came out of businesses to teach their skills in a tech school setting, they're long gone, which is really sad in my mind. Because as I said, probably 60% of our kids will work locally, and there are many businesses in our town who receive their employees out of the tech school system. Yeah.
Yeah. But surely we'll wise up to that and find a solution to that soon.
Well, not looking at that new monstrosity being built on Horden Street. No tech facilities there.
Do you think that
trade?
Do you think that Shep is lacking a strong university presence?
Well, we've got Latrobe Uni, which is here, and it's about students wanting to go to your own university, because in the end, the university can offer courses, and if it's not taken up by students, then they obviously won't run.
Yeah.
So the appeal will need to be, like it was for me, Latrobe University Bundoora had a great history and politics faculty, and that's what I wanted to do, so that was my first choice, and I was lucky enough to get in. If the best history faculty was here at Latrobe Shepparton, that's where, in my day, I would have wanted to be. So we need high quality, inspirational teachers at the university level, particularly say here in Shepparton, who will get locals wanting to go and study with them.
Yeah. I'm going to make a really poor comparison here, and you can correct it for me, but can you tell me the difference between somebody like Alexander the Great, who would have done a lot of terrible things and tried to take over the world, and somebody like Hitler?
Well, the motivation for power.
Yeah. But like Alexander's celebrated and Hitler's condemned.
And if you look at the Holocaust and Hitler's final solution, that's just horrific, and that's why certainly that person should be condemned, and how so many people of the time were fooled, tricked, or feared doing the wrong thing.
Yeah.
I was just watching a movie on telly yesterday, which was basically about the Holocaust and how the Jews were treated in Germany, and it's just so sad. And then I watched another one about a month ago telling the story of Anne Frank, another incredible story in the diary of Anne Frank, and to see what happened to those people in a time that's not that long ago. We're only talking 70 years ago.
Yeah.
It's just hard to contemplate that human beings could be like that.
Yeah.
And then how those strong leaders, through either fear and or control, could have their people cowering. It's it's disgusting. And that's where I think today, in general, our leadership in most of the world makes us a happier place.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I wasn't making an argument for that Hitler was a good person, but I just couldn't, in my imagination, not think that Alexander the Great or somebody like that would have done similar things.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt. But then, in terms of where they were at the time, it was war.
Yeah.
And it's that little bit about, as the Nazis believed, that wherever German people lived should be part of Germany. So those Germans who were living on the edges of Germany or into Belgium or into Holland, into Austria and so on, they were German people, they should be under our banner. And that's just a way of justifying taking over someone else's land.
Yeah. You don't think something like that will ever happen again?
I find it pretty hard to believe when you look at how safe generally the world has been since 1945. We've only had 2 world wars, as they're called, even though World War I wasn't a world war. It was basically Europe and a little bit of the Middle East. But I would hope and expect that we wouldn't see anything like World War II again. Because if it did happen, well, you wouldn't be really going off to fight. You'd be pressing a button and sending bombs, missiles.
Do you think that kids are lacking a sense of purpose because they don't have one of these big events to overcome?
Well, there's so much going on in our world in everyday life for kids that something like that would not be on their mind at all, I would think. Because everyday life, there's something happening. With our current generation, they know, they've got the ability to know a lot more about the world than we did 50 years or 60 years ago. With the internet, the technology that these kids, if they wish to use it, have at hand, they can do all sorts of research. And I'd like to see a little bit more of a push for reading about everyone's past, and it's easy enough to start about your own, just finding out about your own family, and that sort of thing, and your culture. But I'm just a bit concerned about where reading's going as the internet just drives so much. The old day of sitting down at night and reading a book.
Have you done much research on your family history?
I did a lot a few years ago, and being so good with technology, my computer crashed and I lost the lot.
What?
Absolutely lost the lot. My aunt had been to England, this would be 30 years ago, 25 years ago, and she came back with a lot of our British history, and I put that into a genealogy list, and I thought, this is going to be great. And the original handwritten piece of paper I cannot find, and now that computer died and I couldn't get it off. I'm trying through my cousin to see if she's got a copy of what was written, because I thought I'd put this piece of paper away. You know how it is.
Yeah.
Put it away in a special spot.
Yeah.
But we can't find a special spot. Yeah.
Hopefully it shows up one day for you. Yeah. It's interesting, like, I almost feel like personally that school for me was at the wrong age. Like, I was very excited to sit down and have a chat to you today, and like I feel like I could talk to you all day and I would be on the edge of my seat. But if you had have got 15-year-old me or 16-year-old me, I would not have been interested in that at all.
And it can be like that, Harley. And once again, it's about who inspires you. I was very lucky that I had teachers who I wanted to listen to, and I wanted, I guess in a sense, to please, and I worked so that I improved my skills for me and also to please someone else. And it's really difficult, because as I said before, you look around at what the young people have in front of them today. How many kids get to 15 and get a part-time job?
Yeah.
So then that's after school probably gone. The expectation, used to be, for me as a teacher, that I didn't set homework. You had to complete at home what you hadn't done in the appropriate time at school. Because after school, in my mind, is your time for family, for work, for friends. Yeah? So it's about looking after number one, and as a student it's really difficult, and particularly at 15 and 16 there's so much going on in the brain and in society. It's quite difficult for many students to see school as so important.
We've talked about how the students have changed, but do you think the teachers are changing as well?
Oh, for sure. But there's no such... Essentially, there's no such thing as a teacher who does not change across their career.
Yeah.
Because what we did in the 70s was a start to something that those many people who started teaching in the 70s are finishing up now, or are just finished up. And as teachers, they change their techniques, their way of teaching, their way of treating students and treating their colleagues. Our society has come a long way since the 1970s, and you can't stand still or you go backwards.
Yeah. Like, do you think that the teachers that started in the 70s got into it for a love of teaching, where I feel like teachers, some, at least maybe a large minority of teachers these days, get into it just because it's a job?
Well, it is a job, and I think from the 70s, when we had this incredible increase in the number of students and schools, that we needed more teachers. But it wasn't a simple thing. Now, this is just memory. 1977, I was appointed to Cobram Secondary College, Cobram High School. There were about 65 teachers. 18 of us were first year out of university or teachers college, and another 7 were new to the school. So well over a third of our teachers were new.
Mm-hmm.
After 4 years, I sat down at the end of year staff function and looked around and said, where is everybody? I then realised and noted how many had already moved on from 1977. There were probably only about 20 left. Each year, we were getting approximately 20 new teachers to the school. So some would stay and or come back. But yeah, it was just a great change. And that was happening in most schools across the state. Many of us were studentship holders, and the state government paid our university and training, but then we had to give 3 years to teaching. But the vast majority of people in those days were career teachers. And certainly many of the people I connect with from those days retired as teachers. They'd only been to 1 or 2 schools. My best mates, they had both only taught at Shepparton High School all those years, 30 years. Okay, that's an incredible thing. In my experience, I had 3 schools.
Yeah. Do you think teachers who change schools a lot aren't taking it as serious? Is it what you're implying? Or?
Once again, it's about conditions of employment, and the contract system came in the 1990s, and that's put the pressure on teachers. If you get a contract, you generally find you go to the bank to borrow money for a house. You're only on a contract, you mightn't have a job next year.
Yeah.
So that puts the pressure on, and that came into the teaching fraternity back in the 90s in a big way and continued. Now, I think it's great to have a stable workforce, particularly in schools, where it's about making relationships with students so that they feel safe, secure, and have an environment where they can learn.
Yeah.
But if you turn over teachers, you don't have that continuity. Yeah. So there's...
The relationships with the students suffer.
Oh, they certainly do at the moment, I believe. And what's happening in our secondary schools at the moment is very much troubling to me, where teachers are being tossed from campus to campus. The students are told something where they'll be next year, and it turns out that that's not what happens. It's very disappointing, and it will be very difficult for many students to get over the impact of these couple of years of transition to that horrible site on Hordern Street.
Yeah. What would you say to somebody who was aspiring to be a teacher?
I'd say go for it. An absolute classic there, Harley. I was out doing coffee with a mate a couple of days ago, and on the next table was a woman that I taught to be 20-something years ago. And I can remember her like it was just yesterday. Absolutely delightful young woman who went on to become a teacher. And it's the second or third time that I've seen her since she finished. And she just reminded me that I had inspired her to become a teacher. And that's really pleasing. To know that I was able to do something, and I hope and I would believe that she'd be a great teacher from the student that she was all those years ago.
Yeah. A lot of people don't know how the things they do echo, but I feel like as a history teacher, you'd always be mindful of every interaction you have with somebody, because you know how those things pan out.
Yeah, I do a lot of thinking, and I know, as people tell me, an incredible number of people, and I remember them. And I don't know how it happens, but I have images. Well, I've had contacts in the last 12 months with people I grew up with in my hometown who I hadn't spoken to for 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
And then I've been running into students in the last 6 months and whatever. And we know what Facebook's like, how you can find nearly anybody.
Yeah.
And I've had some great experiences catching up with ex-students and people I work with, and just going over the good old times as I see them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you think of another scenario where you've greatly affected a student?
One of the best experiences I've had, I went to my mate's son's wedding maybe 10 or so years ago, doesn't matter when, and one of his mates came up to me and said, "G'day, Mr. Dan, do you still think the world is flat?" Now, I just had a huge laugh about that, Harley, because it just resonated in my mind that I'd got him. Because if you said the world was round, I would prove to you that it was flat. So that was my job. And then you had to prove to me that I was wrong. And
Yeah.
the fact that that young man, who was probably 35 at the time, had remembered that from when I had him in year 7, certainly said, well, I've played with your mind and I've made you think. Yeah, that was a wonderful experience.
Yeah. When you are researching history and you're coming up with your arguments and presenting your findings and stuff like that, how do you stop confirmation bias?
Well, we've all got a bias because we've got our ideas, and in doing that research in history and writing an essay at the senior levels, or even a paragraph, you've got to think about the whole format. So that first sentence, what do I think, then why do I think it, and what evidence have I got? So we can use whatever information we like, but importantly, in a proper study of history, you will have looked at both sides and be able to show why one argument is far more important or stronger than another.
Yeah. Do you think people do that in general?
Probably not.
They just look at the information that they want to believe in.
It's so much easier to do it that way. Yeah. I think this. Can we look at what's just happened in the United States in the last week or so, and about the blinkered view of the world that many of those people must have had in invading the Congress building?
It's crazy.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. 5 people died.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. One was a policeman or security officer was bashed to death by someone with a fire extinguisher, I believe. And that came out of a march on the Congress, something that has happened maybe once in history before, but not to that effect. Yeah. That's a bit scary to me.
Yeah. I have 2 more questions for you, Lindsay. How do you feel about your career in hindsight?
My career.
Yeah. As a teacher,
yeah.
I know you've done more.
Yeah, well, I loved my time as a teacher, and I was in the classroom for 25, 26 years, whatever. And that was my passion. And I just love that, to be able to tell a story and then have someone argue with me about whether I was right or wrong. And that was my way of getting students to think about what was going on in the past, which affected them today. So I'm very happy with all my years in education. And I love the fact that I can wander around this town and run into so many wonderful young people who I taught, and to see how well they're going in general in business or just in their own occupations.
Yeah.
And it's great to have chats.
That's awesome. Would your wife say that you were difficult?
Difficult. I think that would be an understatement. She's a wonderful woman, a very well respected teacher at Wanganui, or was at Wanganui, she's off to Maguire. A wonderful person.
Yeah.
Very proud to call her my wife, Harley. You got to be there.
I'll end on this one, Lindsay. Who locally inspires you?
Well, I'm inspired by my wife and my family. I'm very pleased and proud of everything happening there. I've got wonderful kids and getting an extended family, and I think they're making their mark on the world, and particularly in our Shepparton community. I'm very, very proud of my family. Yeah, my wife and kids inspire me. You got me.
It's all right.
It's all right.
What's your wife up to today?
Well, we've been out for coffee. She's currently looking after our youngest grandchild. Hopefully he's asleep at the moment while I come down and talk with you.
Yeah.
We also had lunch with our eldest boy, Michael. And he and his wife Amy are doing a wonderful job with their son, little Louis, who's suffering a really sad illness called it doesn't matter. I'm not going there. Sorry.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Could you share with me how you met your wife?
How I met my wife. 1983, I'd taken a year without pay and travelled overseas. So I had 10 months travelling through Asia, the Middle East, or India, the Middle East, and Europe. I went from Kathmandu to London on a double-decker bus with top deck tours, and still in contact with people I travelled with then. And then I get back in early December, and I'll go in and I'll talk to my mates at Shepparton High School. So in I go, and I'm standing there talking to Steve and Bruce, and this little woman comes streaming up the staff room, dressed in her finest, and she turns to my mate Steve, who was the daily organiser, and gives him a spray about, that's the second auto prac class I've had in a week or something like that. And like Steve was 6 foot something, Robin's 5'4" or 5, whatever. And Steve's just standing there, and I'm going, who the hell is this? Yeah.
That was the first time you saw her.
The first time I saw her, yeah. And she savaged this big bloke. It was a classic.
That's awesome.
And then I didn't see her until school started the next year in the February.
Yeah.
And we were married by December.
It's amazing. Did you have to work up the courage to ask her out on a date?
I don't even remember the first one in that sense. I just sort of snuck up, I'd say, Harley. I don't know whether it was really just a date.
Yeah.
Well, living in Kerrang, a small community of about 4,000 at that time, teachers in particular stuck together. So our social lives were, if you weren't at football or cricket, it was about a social group out of school.
Yeah.
So teachers did see a fair bit of one another.
What's the secret to a successful relationship?
Oh, well, I should say it's sharing and caring, but I don't know if my wife would think the same thing about me. But, yeah, it's about acknowledging what other people do. Yeah, and I think doing the right thing is important in any part of your life, and certainly around your family is even more so. So sharing and caring is really important.
Thank you for joining me, Lindsay.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks, Harley.
Beautiful.